I'm going to be presenting today part of my PhD project titled Remembering Future Disasters, Temporal Ecologies in the Peruvian Andes. And concretely, that is the title of the presentation, Beyond Place, Encountering Difference in Disastrous Times. I feel like a stranger in my own city, exclaims José Sotelo Mejía to the camera. With a slow and somewhat tired rhythm, the man in his 80s explains the dramatic consequences left by a destructive earthquake in 1970 across his hometown, Huaraz, the capital of the Ancash department in the Peruvian Andes. It is an event remembered by its survivors not only as the full destruction of what used to be their old city, but mostly as a moment that marked a before and after in their lives, the end of the world as they knew it and the beginning of a new, unrecognizable place. In tune with the documentary's calls, a piece called Huaraz Over Time that aims to showcase the glorious past of this former colonial city, the retired journalist and former chief of police had been saying only minutes before that demolishing phrase how Huaraz, prior to the earthquake, was a role model city that had almost perfectly combined tradition with a promising local industry. Chocolate, flour, leather, beer, and soft drinks were the common goods of a market controlled by a modest regional elite that coexisted with ancient Andean products like corn, coca leaves, and potatoes. There, the indio, a very pejorative form of referring to the native population in the colonized Americas, and the criollo, or white and mestizo Peruvians, coexisted in almost an idyllic harmony, marked, of course, by the criolla domination so necessary to maintain order amid the Andean chaos, as some urban actors would affirm. For people like José Sotelo, nowadays little remains from those golden times. First, partially destroyed by a massive flash flood coming from Lake Palcacocha in 1941, and later entirely by the dramatic earthquake in 1970, Huaraz now exists amid its ruins, or rubble, as Gaston Gordillo here present will suggest. In the documentary, an off voice points out, I quote, the 1970 earthquake ended with the literal burial of Huarazino society, as if nothing from before the event had survived, and as if everything that followed was not worthy of being properly considered Huarazino anymore. Survivors of that fateful event, including José Sotelo, narrate with deep sorrow how the recovery process that followed the earthquake was a failed effort to bring social justice, turning the new city into a Pachamanca, a hodgepodge of architectural styles and cultures. The then revolutionary government of Juan Velasco Alvarado aimed to use the destruction left by the earthquake as an opportunity to overcome the old colonial order still ruling the Andean world. As CRIRSA, the state agency in charge of the reconstruction, will exclaim at the time, I quote, the earthquake of the 31st of May 1970 confirmed the unequal and unjust socioeconomic and political order existing in the affected zone, a situation that as revolutionary Peruvians we have the obligation to change through the tasks of reconstruction and rehabilitation, end of quote. Based on an ambitious agrarian reform and a modernization plan for urban areas, the military regime sought to make Ancash a role model region for the entire country, a program that, according to local urban survivors, only brought about the destruction of the traditional order, resulting in chaos, grief, and loss. It was the social disaster after the earthquake, as survivors commonly remember the aftermath. Nowadays, nearly 50% of the population in cities like Huaraz self-identifies as Quechua, one of the country's main ethnic and linguistic groups recognized by the state, compared to 40% who consider themselves mestizo and only 3% white. However, the Quechua population, commonly related with a rural and indigenous past, is still considered an outsider from urban areas. A foreign group that arrived only after 1970 and permanently altered the city's identity. Migrants with rural origins, along with other groups that arrive from different parts of the country, are considered responsible for the new urban constructions of concrete and clay bricks that disrupted the traditional Andean order. They inaugurated, in the eyes of the elderly residents of places like Huaraz, what is commonly defined as the cosmopolitan city, a place without a distinct identity shaped by the countless cultures and architectural styles that arrived in the aftermath of the event. Stories around the 1970 earthquake that struck cities like Huaraz are remarkable examples that address what the figure of the place means when time seems to come to an end. Due to both the ongoing exposition to threatening extreme events, including earthquakes, but also massive flash floods, and the destruction of the old urban project that inaugurated the cosmopolitan city, Huaraz is a case that contests the idea of place as a stable ground where dwelling is possible. This idea, coined by Martin Heidegger during a famous talk of the series Darmstädter Gespräche in 1951, came to offer an understanding of an inhabited space that has influenced architects, artists, and social scientists across decades. Dwelling, or das Wohnen, Heidegger argues, cannot be a consequence of building, but the other way around. We build because we dwell. Also, wir bauen und haben gebaut, insofern wir wohnen, he proclaimed at the time. Inhabiting here goes beyond the simple idea of occupying a built environment and turns into an existential condition. The dwelling is the way that mortals are in the world, he will add. It is only through inhabiting that we can create a sense of peace and belonging, an atmospheric existence, as Peter Sloterdijk will later define it, marked by the definition of an interior and exterior, an inside and outside. In other words, a place in this world. Portrayed as a stable ground where dwelling is possible, the figure of the place is confronting the tumultuous time of an era that, unlike the modern times of infinite growth and hope for the future, cannot guarantee solid foundations for a habitability project. The Anthropocene has ushered in an epoch where any prospect of forthcoming scenarios turn into an almost unbearable task. The present is a time of doubt, ambivalence, and despair, a period in history where alternatives to overcome an imminent collapse seems increasingly difficult to conceive. The future, under these terms, is a prospect of a gloomy picture that we might not want, something that, in one way or another, survivors in Huaraz have already experienced since the end of their own world and the ongoing hazards threatening to leave the new city in its ruins again. Inhabiting the times of the end, as Bruno Latour defines our current historical moment, requires thinking of novel ways of creating planetary dwelling beyond the security and stability that the commonality of the place provides. Here is that I respond to the call of the symposium to reflect on the necessary task of conceiving new figures to inhabit the uninhabitable. To achieve this, in what follows, I will explore, with the help of the region of Ancash, and specifically the geographical zone known as the Callejón de Huaylas, a figure that I believe is a valuable contribution to addressing the call to think of places differently. This is the figure of the tinku, a Quechua word describing sites and objects where gatherings in difference takes place. However, to do this, it will be necessary to first explore an initial historical figure that is fundamental to understanding the spatial and temporal configuration of Peruvian society, the idea of the encounter. I'm gonna make a water pause, sorry. As with any other region shaped by colonialism, the history of the Callejón de Huaylas is a history of encounters and conflicts. The colonization of the New World, as Spanish settlers euphemistically described the American continent, was in any case a peaceful process of land occupation occurring in an empty, tranquil space. Those originators of history who arrived more than 500 years ago to conquer lands of immense wealth had to confront two main unexpected inhabitants, sometimes portrayed indistinguishably: the unrolled forces of nature and the native population. The foundation of the colonial city was a continuous process aimed at controlling what, for the Spaniards, was an unruled and chaotic environment. Exposed to forces like earthquakes, floods, landslides, and volcanic eruptions, as the illustration in the back shows, these new settlers had to deal with the destruction of their settlements several times over the years. Before the 1970 earthquake or any modern glacial-based flood, the Callejón de Huaylas experienced the complete burial of its capital, Ancash, in 1537, when a massive landslide, probably triggered by an earthquake that struck the region, came down from the mountains, destroying everything in its path. An event that will happen again in 1970, when the earthquake of the year that triggered a massive landslide from the Huascarán mountain that completely buried the city of Yungay and several villages in the highlands. The promised land of infinite riches and astonishing beauty was also a place where nature manifested itself violently. A second fundamental encounter shaping Peru's history is related to native population. The arrival of colonial rule over the Americas was accompanied by an ongoing process of land robbery, forced religious conversion, and genocide. The clashes that colonialism entailed form what history strives to present as two main realities, two main worlds that intersected at some point: the Spanish colonization and the native world, the criollos and Indios, lowlands and highlands, civilization and barbarism. These social groups, with the passage of time, created new forms of distinctions, new configurations, while retaining the old ones as sediment that accumulated over the years. The encounter as historical moment has certainly shaped the identity of Peru as a nation, the encounter of worlds, tradition, and cultures. It is an attitude towards history that, although problematic due to the inextricable essentialization it commonly creates, has been pivotal for the articulation of a national identity based on a hybrid synthesis. As Marisol de la Cadena would suggest, a plain result of the biological or cultural mixture of two formally discrete entities: the Indio, belonging to our unruled land and as such related to the destruction that nature can trigger, and the Criollo, related to an urban order providing security and stability. Whereas in some cases, the expression of these encounters had been related to a syncretic harmony, embodied ultimately in the figure of the mestizo, authors like Antonio Cornejo Polar instead suggest that these encounters have inaugurated a transcultural existence based on precarity and exclusion. I quote Cornejo Polar, forced, difficult, painful, and traumatic cohabitation. This view of the encounter as a moment that highlights the conflict and not the union relates to what Marie-Louise Prat defined as the contact zones. I quote, social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, and their aftermaths. Encounters as contact zones are, in words of Anna Singh, forms of friction. I quote again, the awkward, unique, and unstable and creative qualities of interconnection across difference. They are moments of strict domination, but from where new political arrangements emerge, sometimes as a form of exploitation, but also as subordinated resistance against the dominant culture. In my work, which deals with the complex and multiple connections between disasters and time, I explore how the figure of the encounter has shaped the politics for dealing with flood risk management in the region of Ancash, by analyzing different places and objects where the idea of the encounter between different realities is portrayed in one way or another. A starting point for this exploration was the case of an early warning system installed next to the Lake 513, a water body recently formed as a consequence of the melting of the glacier with the same name that, due to the instability of its moraine dike, could generate a runoff strong enough to put cities and villages downstream at risk. This type of hazard, known by scientific community as a glacial lake outburst flood, or GLOF, is a type of phenomenon that have threatened settlements in the Callejón de Huaylas over the past century and has been a direct consequence of climate change. The same 1941 flood over Huaraz was an example of this phenomenon. The early warning system, or SAT, for Sistema de Alerta Temprana, as it is commonly called, was a network of several monitoring stations that aimed to give notice in case the tide of the lake presented anomalous behavior, which could provide the population with enough time to evacuate the exposed areas. However, about a year after its installation, the stations located close to the lake were destroyed by a group of campesinos, the Spanish word for farmers or peasants, or more specifically, comuneros, members of the campesino communities, because they allegedly blamed those foreign machines for blocking the rain, the ultimate explanation for a severe drought affecting the region in the past years. Similar to the reactions that the reconstruction of cities after 1970 in the region aroused, the urban population saw in the destruction of the equipment a clear example of the barbaric nature and superstitious beliefs of the rural population located in the higher lands of the Callejón de Huaylas. It was an expression of the urban world's main concern throughout the country's colonial history, an unrolled rurality compared in many cases with those floods coming from lakes in the mountains, threatening to outburst and invade the lower urban world. But at the same time, it was the reaction of a rural world that saw its urban counterpart as a menace to their autonomy and the protection of their territories. The destroyed foreign machines were associated in many cases with the figure of the gringo, or of mining companies as well, and the extractivist projects embodying the real dangers that communities in the highlands were facing. The destruction of the territory at the hands of foreign investors fostered by a noticeably absent state apparatus. The case of the early warning system was a compelling starting point and a central ethnographic moment to study controversies around past and future disasters. But above all, it allowed me to open up the idea of encounter by suggesting that these gatherings were never between two intrinsically antagonistic figures after all. Behind the destruction of the early warning system, there was much more than two groups fighting for what we could understand as two different forms of war production. The archetypical construction of an urban, scientifically driven population against a native world aiming to preserve and defend its lands and tradition was very soon dissolved by a much more complex scenario. Whereas some people associated the episode with an attempt to steal the equipment and make some profit from it, others say that it was a politically driven action due to an ongoing conflict of water capture between a city and the lowlands and towns located in the higher areas of the region. Other versions of the facts relate the attack to the strong awareness that the presence of mining projects in the region has raised among rural inhabitants. The most common version, however, affirms that comuneros were indeed worried about the introduction of those foreign machines and their environmental consequences. These conjectures, though, were not new in the zone. Similar situations as in Lake 513 were experienced close from there in the past. Back then, local residents destroyed a meteorological station installed close to other lake and expelled the group of glaciologists in charge of the project. The community apparently gave similar reasons as those exposed in the case of Lake 513, that the station was producing a drought. Responses to the technological devices in the region have been commonly linked to the traditional relations people in the Andes have with other than human entities, what Marisol de la Cadena has translated elsewhere as earth beings or tiracuna. For the Quechua-speaking world, elements like lakes and mountains are considered sentient entities that play a fundamental role in the communities they take part. However, the current relationship between comunidades campesinas and elements like lakes is far from straightforward form of Andean animism. Many members of comunidades campesinas deny the practice of any form of relationship with entities like mountains or lakes. They don't give pagos or offerings to these entities, and many even deny consuming coca leaves, for example, a plant historically related to indigenous communities. The fact that people deny having relations with lakes or mountains, however, doesn't mean that these forms of connections are fully gone. Many still consider lakes as dangerous places, entities that can trick people with false treasures and cause death. Even engineers and authorities working around lakes affirm that pagos are conducted to keep lakes under control. Otherwise, the water level starts to increase and the draining systems fail. It is an interesting case where, far from having two clearly defined systems of knowledge, forms to relate with the environment are profoundly entangled, revealing an ecology of practices that escape of any straightforward classification of science against indigenous cosmovisions. But despite this complex meshwork of practices and relations, the two initial figures in dispute, the highlands embodying the figure of the comunero, and the lowlands embodied in the urban project, are still strongly present and applied to make sense of the world. They are not only cognitive or conceptual figurations, as Norbert Elias will define the network of actors trying to make sense of their environments, but they are not merely actual arrangements either. Figures like the comunero, formerly the indio or indígena, have a material existence, in many cases associated with the idea of the ground, as Bernd Olof rightfully suggests. But it also has a virtual existence, as a figure that cannot be fully contained in any form of concrete presence. The rural other, whether it be the indio, indígena, campesino, or comunero, has been the solidification of skins, garments, construction materials, certain type of technologies, but also stories. Stories of resistance, domination, genocide, and also of institutional recognition and legal bonds. These stories escape the immediate presence of the material world while being contained within it simultaneously. It is a semiotic and material existence defined by both presence and absence, or, paraphrasing Ignacio during the introduction of the symposium, more than actuality but less than abstraction. And it is precisely things like the destroyed early warning systems where those figures are materialized and expressed through what we can conceptualize as the encounter. So defining these sites and things of encounters was an initial challenge I faced during my work. Initially, I referred to them as gateways, since they offered a connection between these divergent figures. However, a gateway implies a displacement, a movement from one point to another. And here I was dealing precisely with the opposite, a placement of figures giving shape to something else. I also relate them to the idea of contact zones proposed by Marie-Louise Prat or the concept of friction suggested by Anna Singh. Yet, both concepts speak more about the clash of different projects and their connections, rather than the site or the object where those conflictive connections take place. Instead of focusing solely on the encounter between different figures, what was fundamental for me was to explore the objects and sites themselves, their stories, material conditions, and the kind of role that the ecology of materialities and practices around them fulfilled in shaping the idea of encounter. Interestingly, there is a very accurate concept in Quechua that defines what I'm trying to express here. That site or thing emerging from the violent harmony characterizing the rugged encounters shaped the Andean worlds. The notion of tinkuy, which can be roughly translated as to encounter in the difference. According to the ethnohistorian Pierre Dubois, tinkuy can be traced back to a series of ritual battles that originated from the war in which the Incas, led by Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, defeated the Changas and consolidated the Tiwantansuyu, or the Incan rule over the four Suyus at the beginning of the 15th century. Despite its combative origins, the word nowadays has broader applications. A tinku, as a noun, can refer to festive fights and chiropolitical dances, but also to concrete encounters, applied nowadays as a synonym for gathering. In some regions, the concept is used to name meetings between children with different cultural backgrounds, a space that embraces cultural exchanges in a country with extremely diverse traditions. According to Catherine Allen, tinku refers to concrete things and sites, like places where roads join or rivers converge, producing a single largest stream. I quote Catherine Allen, "Tinkus are powerful, dangerous places full of liberated and uncontrollable forces, where antagonists meet in a violent union." It works as a noun and verb, although in strict sense the Y termination denotes an action, and its use always implies a specific situation defined by the act of gathering. Due to its particular meaning, it is a concept that escapes proper translation. Allen suggests that tinkuy can be associated with the notion of dialectic. However, she immediately affirms this concept is far too abstract. More than a form of reasoning, tinku refers to the concrete act of gathering in the difference, and tinku, the specific side or thing emerging from that encounter. The interesting characteristic of tinkuy is that these encounters are not only spatial but also temporal, a condition that has to do with the simultaneous coexistence of what comes before and after in the Andean cosmology. Animals, for example, are considered tinkus or tinkukuna, according to the plural construction in Quechua, because they are an expression of where antagonist worlds converge. Due to the constant and extensive displacement across different ecological floors, animals like birds or foxes are described as connecting points between the three main Andean worlds, the Pacha, or Pachas, the Hanampacha or world above, the Ukupacha or middle world, and the Kaipacha or underworld. Animals not only connect spatial dimensions, but also temporal ones. As the world of the ancestors and deaths, the Kaipacha is at the same time the world of the known, or what has been seen already, and thus in front of your eyes, related to the figure of Ñaupac, as Marisol de la Cadena explains. As the world above, the Hanampacha is related to what is still unknown, related to the word Hipak, or what is behind your back, and thus the unseen. As entities bringing these different dimensions together, birds and foxes have the capacity to inform about things that may happen or bring messages from ancestors and people who have passed away. Time, under this view, is not something that passes linearly, but simultaneously, with the already seen, the actual, and the unseen taking place at the same time and condensed in elements like tinkukuna and their stories. The tinku offer a novel approach to understanding how the sense of being in the world, and thus changing with it, is given by this permanent tension that the encounter of different worlds and the results from it entails. To explore this idea, I want to come back to the destruction and reconstruction of Huaraz after the 1970 earthquake. The testimonies of people like José Sotelo Mejía, presented at the very beginning of this presentation, speak about a place that has lost its ultimate capacity of providing an existential dwelling in Heideggerian terms. For urban survivors of the event, the actual city is a non-place, a site that cannot offer an atmospheric contention because it emerged from the collapse of its borders. What was outside of it, the rural world, destroyed its interior and invaded it, like an outburst flood coming down from the mountains. Yet, this view of the city oversimplifies what we find nowadays there and the diverse urban projects that can be found over the rubble of the old city. During my visits to the new neighborhoods that emerged after the earthquake, many of them located in areas exposed to a possible outburst flood, similar to the one that devastated Huaraz in 1941, I had the chance to talk with those new Huarazinos who arrived in the city with their families after the complete destruction of their hometowns in rural areas of the region as a consequence as well of the 1970 earthquake. Their stories are supported by all sorts of materials that allow them to inhabit the new lands where they settled. First, through materiales a mano, or materials at hand, with which they improvise model shelters against the rain and the cold. And later, more stable materials like clay bricks and concrete with which they could build more permanent houses. However, theirs was always conceived as a temporal dwelling, hoping that authorities will provide them with more stable housing solutions in areas not exposed to an imminent flood. These new Huarazinos build their lives there as something transitory, even though that transition has been an ongoing state for more than 30 years already. Construction materials have played a fundamental role for giving new Huarazinos certain stability among the temporal conditions of their settlements. Moving from materials at hand to mud bricks and later to other materials like concrete and clay bricks had given these inhabitants a sense of permanence, not only because of the alleged robustness they portray, but also the status they confer. Transitioning from materials at hand and mud bricks to materiales nobles, or noble materials, as clay bricks and concrete are referred to in the Callejón de Huaylas, is a strategy these families employ to distance themselves from the rural past, the negative aspects of it at least, rurality as precarity, ignorance, and dirt. Bricks and concrete brings promises of material stability and dwelling possibilities, such as the capacity to better resist earthquakes or increase the height of their houses, even to the point of reaching 5 stories. However, these are also precisely the materials that the elder Huaracinos who survived the earthquake and their families used to exemplify the inauguration of the cosmopolitan city, a city without identity, without past or future, a city that cannot be inhabited and thus cannot be defined as a proper place. It is in materials like bricks and concretes where this duality is produced and where the figures emerging from and giving sense to that duality gather. They gather precisely in both spatial and temporal terms. Spatially, because there are elements that configure a here and there, the old city and the cosmopolitan one, shape that encounter. And temporally, because there are materials that create a temporal dissonance. They open the possibility of building a stable future and escaping from a precarious past, as rural families shows, while they restrict the possibility of bringing back the past of a city subsumed in stagnation, according to urban survivors. This is precisely the conflictive encounter that tinku helps to conceptualize, an existence shaped by the conflictive tension that difference, both in space and time, elicit. So I want to conclude this presentation by returning to Heidegger and his notion of place as dwelling. It might be argued that given the notion of encounters such a centrality for exploring the configuration of space in the Latin American context, ran the risk of reifying that figure in such a way that anything outside that moment of interaction becomes irrelevant, as if anything beyond it will not be interesting enough to be described. In this sense, reality becomes a permanent battleground where anything beyond that encountered is dismissed. However, we must not forget that the counterpart figure of the idea of the encounter, the figure of place as dwelling, as we saw at the beginning, also strongly relies on the conflictive arrangement of reality. Yet, it is a hidden conflict, one that doesn't happen when the place is produced, but before that, when the place has not yet been conquered. Heidegger's connection of dwelling, peace, permanence, and protections is not coincidental. The philosopher made this intervention 6 years after the end of the Second World War, a moment when he may have tried to distance himself from the close association he had with the National Socialist project in the past. It is by embracing the peacefulness, protection, and security that dwelling provides, he would have been neglecting all the horrors that the regime, his regime, committed to ensure that the dwelling of such a totalitarian project could take place. But there is another aspect of Heidegger's notion of dwelling that needs to be mentioned. In the aforementioned talk, the philosopher also relates the notion of inhabiting, wohnen, to the Old German word wohnen. Wohnen can be associated with joy and happiness, but in modern German, the word is also associated with gewinnen, to win, to deserve something. The idea behind this relation is that the joy of the inhabited space needs to be earned somehow, an existential condition that must be achieved and protected. And that might explain why the philosopher emphasized several times during his intervention that the essential feature of inhabiting is protection. So the Grundsatz des Wohnens is a shonen. This idea, which might even sound intuitive, connects to what is perhaps one of the most awful legacies of the German nationalist project, the concept of Lebensraum, or the living space. Originally, a geographic term coined by Oskar Peschel to designate the different layers of biological inhabitability, the notion of Lebensraum was later appropriated with imperial purposes to justify the necessary occupation of lands outside the German borders and ensure the development of a Völkisch nationalist project. Zum Wohnen, or to inhabit, under this view, became an existential condition that was made possible through another pure operation, war and ethnic cleansing. Without going further, the expansion of the Lebensraum was one of Hitler's main arguments to lead Germany towards the Second World War. In other words, if inhabitability is the precondition for building, territorial expansionism is, according to Heideggerian view, the precondition of inhabiting. Building the world requires conquering. That's the final lesson he gave us. This is where the figure of the tinku can bring another perspective. A place or moment built on difference doesn't need to hide conflict as an allegorical explanation of how things work. It neither needs to justify its existence based on a previous expansion and protection of the inhabited space. The idea that war brings inhabitability expires when war is not a precondition for a living space, but its ultimate characteristic, or rather than war, simply the conflict. In the tinku, the idea of dwelling as the ultimate spatial and temporal stage dissolves and turns into a constant exercise of diplomacy, as Bruno Latour will suggest. In order to live together, to dwell together, we need to cohabit in the difference and eventually become something else together. It is, at the end of the day, an opening towards change that the conservative orientation of place as dwelling and dwelling as protected atmosphere can hardly offer. So in this presentation, I didn't intend to offer an ultimate conceptual solution for the crisis of place, not even a first attempt to deal with it. What I'll try to show with the figure of the tinku is maybe not so dissimilar from what scholars like Doreen Massey did decades ago with her understanding of place as multiple, open, socially reproduced, and historically accumulated. It is also somehow related to what Gilles Deleuze presents through the notion of becoming, a relational opening to the exterior that moves beyond the boundaries and layers of the territory. Rather, what I have shown here is a concrete concept, a spatial and temporal figure that helped me to deal methodologically with the figure of the encounter, and at the same time with historical figures that gather in that spatial figure. Encounters shaped by destruction, recovery, frustration, but also hopes and desires. Those are the tensions and conflicts that tinku helps to make explicit. And working with those tensions is perhaps what the Anthropocene, as an era of planetary transformations and collapse, an era without a future, but still not at the end of time, require us to do. Disastrous times, like the times in the aftermath of an earthquake, are not necessarily the burial of society, as the off voice at the beginning suggested, but an intrinsic part of it. It is a composing moment in which new forms of relations, new becoming with, takes place. That final pun was intended. Thank you.